Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So, I have finally completed a full analysis of all the classes, subclasses, and related spells in Playtest 6. And it only took me a little over a month, and if you've been watching those videos, watching them took you hours and hours because there's so much content. So this is a wrap-up video where I'm going to go over the things that were the definite high points and low points in the document as a whole. If you want a more detailed analysis of any of the areas I'm covering in this video, check out my 1D&D playlist where I have dedicated videos where I go over all the fine details regarding every revision we saw in the playtest, including the ones that I'm not going to be mentioning here. In regards to the classes, there were 7 classes presented in this document, and 6 of those 7 were second go-rounds of previously presented classes. There were also 25 subclasses presented here. 2 of them were brand new, the College of Dance for the Bard and the Circle of Sea for the Druid. There are also 3 subclasses that are presented as options for these 7 classes that didn't get a revision in this playtest, so they weren't printed at all, and those were the Circle of Stars Druid, the Way of Mercy Monk, which apparently is going to be called the Warrior of Mercy now, and the Fey Wanderer Ranger. And those are all, good subclasses already, in my opinion, so it didn't really concern me that they didn't bother with revisions on those. Some of the presented subclasses only had minor changes. Others had huge redesigns. Other than that, the playtest didn't have much more in it. There were some spell redesigns, but generally spells associated with classes, and then with feats there were a couple minor tweaks, but weapon mastery and the rules glossary, they weren't changed, though I would expect weapon mastery is likely to see lots of changes in the next playtest now that they've had a chance to process the survey feedback from its introduction in playtest 5. So I went through the document looking for what I consider the highlights, what I consider the lowlights, so I'm presenting the stuff that stood out to me. So when I don't mention, College of Valor, it's because although it had some changes, overall I thought it was fine, but not really exciting one way or the other. I'm going to start out with the stuff that was a big thumbs down for me, and move to the stuff that was a big thumbs up. So the final class presented in the 2024 Player's Handbook playtest was the Monk, which I consider mechanically the weakest class in the 2014 Player's Handbook. But not just the weakest, it's also plagued with design issues, like all the class and subclass limited use features all drawing from the same resource pool that dwindles way too fast, and because those limited features aren't of equivalent value, some won't ever get used, because in order to use them, you would have to sacrifice a use of one of the better options. That limited resource also makes the Monk really short rest hungry, because it drains so quickly, and the Monk is basically begging for another short rest after every fight, at least in levels of play that we see the most often. The Monk is also designed to be more effective when they don't wear armor, but that design fails to adequately compensate the Monk defensively with the lackluster unarmored defense feature, which pretty much assures that the Monk will have a lower armor class as well as lower potential for armor class later than most other character classes. And even other classes with lower armor classes have other ways to compensate with build decisions you can do. But the prohibition on armor for base features of the Monk keeps them from benefiting as much from similar strategies. The damage potential of the Monk is also lower than other characters focused on attacks, largely because the Monk can't really benefit from the damage boosting feats other classes can select, but also other classes are benefiting from class and subclass features that improve offensive capability. And when the Monk or its subclasses are given these kinds of features, they inevitably drain the same single resource. So you always have to give something else up in order to use them. And even if you do, you can't use them enough to make up the difference. So when we got to the playtest 6 Monk, I could pretty much list the exact same concerns verbatim. The Monk did get some minor boosts, like being able to take a short rest more quickly once at 7th level. Stunning Strike can be delivered with a ranged attack. The martial arts die was increased by a die type. Step of the Wind now provides both the dash and disengage options, and now the Monk can remove the Frightened or Charmed condition with a bonus action. Except, in addition to all these small benefits, they are all offset by ways the Monk was made less powerful. In fact, I would argue the nerfs outweigh the boosts. Weapons no longer benefit from the martial arts die scaling. The removal of any martial weapon proficiency locks them out of all the best feats, The duration of Stunning Strike was reduced, and it got a once per turn restriction, and they lost immunity to poison. The other changes were just cosmetic, like key points were renamed to Discipline points, and Diamond Soul was renamed to Discipline Survivor, but those are just name changes. And the Monk is the only base class in this document. I would say, just give me the 2014 version. That's better. So a big thumbs down for the Monk. My biggest thumbs down in this playtest document. Next was the Gloom Stalker subclass for the Ranger. Now it's pretty common knowledge that the Gloom Stalker is by far the most powerful Ranger subclass. And toning it down, within reason, I think would be acceptable to most players. But wow, was I disappointed with this revision of the Gloom Stalker. The hardest hit this Gloom Stalker takes is actually not at 3rd level where you would think it would be, it's at 11th level, which is a weird place to nerf a subclass that is known for getting 90% of its stuff at level 3. What they added here, though, was the weirdest part. They gave the Gloom Stalker the ability to frighten creatures they hit with a weapon. I mean, if you get hit with a weapon, I suppose that's frightening, but it's normally not giving you the frightened condition, and I don't really understand why being hit with a weapon by a Gloom Stalker is any more frightening than being hit with a weapon by a Berserker, for example. I can't really envision what's happening here, and they don't explain it. And then there's this negative interaction of the frightened condition and the invisible condition that Umbral Sight can provide the Gloom Stalker. The frightened condition says the disadvantage on attacks and ability checks only occurs if you can see the source of your fear. So, if the Gloom Stalker isn't visible to you, frightened isn't a very good condition to be imposing. On that topic, I had an interesting debate with a player who was confident that in the playtest, you could see someone who was invisible since the condition no longer explicitly says you can't be seen. I mean, it does say you aren't affected by any effect that requires you to be seen, and later says that a creature can see you with blind sight, which implies to me that otherwise you can't be seen. But nevertheless, at least one player who read this carefully noted it didn't explicitly state an invisible creature is impossible to see without the aid of magic or a special sense. For now, personally, I'm assuming an invisible creature is invisible, but let me know what you think in the comments. Gloom Stalker, though, thumbs down. I just don't understand what they're trying to go for at all. Maybe they have some great thematics for this and they just haven't explained them, but they need to explain them. And since I'm talking about subclasses that disappointed, I should also mention the Warrior of the Hand subclass for the Monk. So this was a redesign of the Way of the Open Hand Monk, and they made it worse. I'm not going to talk about this very long, but they did not need to tone down the Way of the Open Hand subclass. Now what they've done is they've added saving throws where there shouldn't be saving throws. The 11th level feature can't even be used in conjunction with the 3rd level feature, so they've put 2 features here that are in direct opposition to each other. They've added discipline point expenses that weren't here before, and they nerfed the capstone. It's like a Mack truck just rolled over this poor subclass. Thumbs down. The Ranger was another low point in this document, because although I would take this version of the Ranger over the 2014 version, I don't know that I would take it over the Ranger post-Tash's optional class features, and definitely not over the Playtest 2 Ranger. So I consider the Ranger in this document a step in the wrong direction. There were 2 things on this Ranger that just shouldn't have happened. The first was Deft Explorer. And listen, Deft Explorer from Tash's, the optional replacement for Natural Explorer, is just fine. It's a decent feature with some nice scaling with your Ranger level, and here it does get the same scaling, but each time that's presented as a new class feature. So you're not really getting any extra features anymore, except one. The inclusion of selected terrain types. And here it's for like really small benefits. You get advantage on nature checks about the terrain and advantage on tracking well in the terrain. Now honestly, they could have just given the Ranger advantage on tracking and nature checks regarding terrain, but instead they put this limitation on it where you select 2 terrains and those are the only places you get the benefit, and they made it a scaling feature where you select more terrains later, but it's never going to cover all terrains. Like, you could have all these terrains, and if you want to track in an urban environment, too bad. This is just a big miss, and they haven't done terrain picking for the Ranger since the 2014 Player's Handbook. So this was a step backwards to a version of the Ranger that I just don't want back. The other thing that shouldn't have happened here is favored enemy. Now, I'm glad they haven't gone back to us selecting creature types, because in the 2014 Player's Handbook, favored enemy is a mess. But giving the Ranger the ability to concentrate on extra first level Hunter's Mark spells just was never going to sit well with players. Now, apparently because of feedback from Playtest 2, they felt they had to take away concentration free Hunter's Mark. But if so, giving free castings of first level Hunter's Mark with concentration, that wasn't the answer. What we ended up with here is a feature that's going to be somewhat similar to Tasha's Favored Foe, which was the optional replacement for Favored Enemy in Tasha's, except this is arguably worse, because the die type doesn't scale with Ranger level, and it uses the Ranger's bonus action. So unfortunately, the Ranger was also a thumbs down for me. Now the Cleric, on the other hand, didn't get many changes at all. I mean, it looks a lot like the 2014 Cleric. And you know what? I guess that's okay, because when I think of the classes that need serious redesign from the old Player's Handbook, the Cleric just isn't on that list. However, this version of Divine Intervention and the greater version don't work. I can see what they were going for, but they didn't stick the landing. Other than that, though, this Cleric is, well, fine, but not really different, so what we end up with is a class where the only real serious change isn't well done. But I do think it's easy to fix, so a small thumbs down for the Cleric. The biggest change to an existing subclass has to be the Warrior of the Elements, which is a complete bottom-up redesign of the Way of the Four Elements monk. Now, I don't want to give the wrong impression that this subclass is fine, because it still needs work. But this is a replacement of the Way of Four Elements monk subclass, and that's a subclass that is notorious for being a massive drain on key points for effects that are mostly underwhelming, poorly worded features, all in an overly complex framework that doesn't really work. So they rebuilt it from the ground up, and this version is less complex, still has some cool things you can do, and has less ambiguity. What it doesn't have is the right balance. These features need to be rebalanced, and I'm looking at you, especially Environmental Burst, but the Warrior of Elements is a promising start. So, small thumbs up. Now, the Bard maybe wasn't rebuilt from the ground up like the Warrior of Elements was, but it did have a pretty big overhaul. Spellcasting for this Bard is unrecognizable from any version of the Bard I've ever seen. Full spellcasting from any of the 3 spell lists you choose, and eventually all 3 spell lists. This was a huge change from Playtest 2, when the Bard actually had a highly restrictive spell selection process. This is almost a full 180. The Bard Inspiration was changed back to how it worked for the 2014 Bard. They had teased Inspiration that used a reaction, now it's back to using a bonus action. And Counter Charm, the feature we were glad to say good riddance to, is back, but now it's actually pretty good. Switching it from an action to a reaction was a great fix. I think I like this more than the 2014 Bard, and I think I like this more than the Playtest 2 Bard as well. But it's hard to say because this change is big enough. I think we'll need to play with it for a while to really get our heads around how this Bard is going to work and affect the game. Not in just some one-shots, but in an extended campaign where maybe you're going from 1st level to 12th level or 13th level over years of play. Obviously, we're not going to get that much time to playtest this, so my opinions on this might change, maybe dramatically, in either direction. But for now, for me at least, it's a temporary small thumbs up. I will be covering both new subclasses in sequence here, just because my overall impression of each of them is pretty similar. The College of Dance Bard is entirely new, and I like new stuff, so that is a point in its favor right from the start. And the thematics work for me too. The features, I think, are just fine for a starting point, but definitely not for a finished product. The balance on this just needs some work. Some of the features are probably too good, others probably too weak. Hopefully they get this eventually, but for now, it is a small thumbs up. Then the Circle of the Sea Druid is also entirely new, and again, I'm pretty happy with the thematics. Now, I was concerned that this one might have features that were too amped up. Then again, I've been assured by players since that in fact maybe this needs to be made more powerful, not less, and admittedly, I haven't playtested this. But 10 minutes of action and concentration-free damage and pushing seem pretty powerful to me for one use of Wild Shape. But you know what? Maybe I'm wrong. But for now, as far as I'm concerned, this is a small thumbs up. And then we go from a Druid subclass to the Druid base class, which got a major change. Now, the less said about the previous playtest Druid, probably the better. But compared to the 2014 Druid, getting rid of the metal armor prohibition was an easy win. Wild Shape uses scaling with Druid level makes more sense. The ability to switch spell slots and Wild Shape uses is a nice addition. The improvement of attack and cantrip damage with Druid level is a nice addition. Being able to speak while Wild Shaped, that's huge in my opinion. I mean, I will choose a race with telepathy when I play a Druid just to get around that. But just keeping your own hit points, that's cleaner. And as sorry as I am to see trying to make templates work for Wild Shape abandoned entirely, I am still hoping to see the end of player shopping stat blocks in the Monster Manual. But overall, I can get behind this version of the build. So we're getting to the more solid stuff. This is just a straight up thumbs up. Remember how I didn't really understand the direction they went with the Gloom Stalker? Well, I can say the opposite for the Assassin. I mean, thematically, there's definitely some overlap with the Gloom Stalker and Assassin thematics. But while the revised Gloom Stalker seems like it's achieving those thematics less, the Assassin is achieving the thematics I envision for this subclass more. The advantage on initiative rolls, the bonus damage to sneak attack on your first turn into combat, the extra damage when a creature fails a saving throw against the Envenom Weapon's Cunning Strike option. These are all good changes in my opinion that help the class mechanically as well as thematically. I also like that the Assassin no longer relies on getting surprised to be effective. On that subject, I'm pretty much convinced at this point that surprise as we know it, where you lose your turn on round 1, isn't going to be a thing in the 2024 Player's Handbook. I mean, at all. But we'll see. So this is a thumbs up for me, but I will say in regards to surprise, I think what is going to happen is if you successfully sneak up on an enemy, you'll start the combat with the invisible condition instead, which gives you advantage on the initiative roll, and that's going to be redundant with the Assassin feature. I mean, if they handle it that way, which is yet to be seen. We're sticking with the sneaky subclasses, I guess, because now let's talk about the Warrior of Shadow. So there were so few bright spots for me with the Monk, but the Warrior of Shadow honestly looked pretty fun to me. I mean, if they fix the Monk. And yes, the Warrior of Shadow Monk may also need some tweaking to make sure that Magical Darkness doesn't end up being a thorn in the side of the other players. I mean, maybe being able to move it at the start of your turn is enough. Or maybe they should have some additional methods to keep it from being a hindrance to party members. But nevertheless, this looks a whole lot more interesting now, so thumbs up. Now for one that might be controversial, but next up is the Paladin base class. And I say it might be controversial because they changed Divine Smite in a pretty dramatic way, and unlike some of the other big changes in this playtest, Divine Smite is a feature that a lot of players, and I'm guessing here, but my assumption would be most players, liked it as it was. Now it was replaced with Paladin Smite, which turns smiting into a bunch of bonus action spells that you can cast after hitting with an attack to apply the extra damage and a host of other effects that you choose at the time of casting. Now, as far as I was concerned, I thought this was so much more interesting than just adding damage with Divine Smite, but that's just my opinion. And there's no question there's a large number of players this has rubbed the wrong way. I've heard from players concerned that Rakshasas are now going to be immune to smites, and that their smites might be counterspelled, or how this will prevent a Barbarian Paladin multiclass from smiting while raging. And of course, a lot of concern that if the Paladin has a bonus action attack option, there will be a conflict with smiting. What I haven't heard much are complaints about the once per turn thing, though that might be because those complaints already happened with the last playtest Paladin, since that restriction was already introduced there. Now, I would like to give this Paladin a big thumbs up, but I'm not going to, because my prediction is they're not keeping this version of Paladin Smite. I'm hoping we don't go back to the old Divine Smite, but who knows. Obviously, I have no more information about survey responses than any of you do, but I at least have the feeling they won't have gotten enough positive response that, at a minimum, they're going to have to take another pass at smiting. But if they give up and just go back to the old version of Divine Smite, I'll be pretty disappointed. However, for now, thumbs up. Now we're getting into my favorite stuff in the playtest document. When you take a subclass that is ho-hum fine, and then make me excited to play it, well, then that is something that happened exactly with the Circle of the Land Druid. The thematic plant-based stuff I think is great. The extra focus on spellcasting, also great. Like, this is a real druid devoted to spells. I don't have much more to say here than, don't change a thing. Big thumbs up. Now, I was confident the rogue would look better in this playtest. I knew there was a very good chance that they would revert sneak attack to the 2014 version, and they did, and that was good. And if that is all they had done here, I think a lot of players would have given the rogue a passing grade, but like a C-. However, I was surprised to see Cunning Strike, where the rogue is given the ability to sacrifice damage dice from sneak attack to do other things. Cunning Strike just seems very cool, and it's encouraging to see that these kinds of ideas are still coming in these playtests, because Jeremy Crawford had indicated in an interview that they were getting to the end of testing the appetite for change, but clearly we aren't quite at the end yet. I think Cunning Strike is a great idea to make the rogue more interesting to play, so this was a big thumbs up from me, and definitely a high point in this packet. But now for my biggest thumbs up, is for the Trickery Domain subclass for Cleric. It's all about the new version of Invoke Duplicity, which has been an ignorable feature on the old Trickery Domain, but here it is fresh and exciting and way different. Now, I gushed over this subclass, and I did get some comments wondering if, didn't I find this overpowered? My reaction here isn't necessarily a score on game balance. I mean, it is hard to judge game balance on a feature that is so unlike any other feature in the game just by reading it. My reaction is a score on how fun this looks. I am concerned it's overpowered, but you know, if it is overpowered, then maybe some tweaks could tone it down a bit. But I appreciate that this isn't a mindless power boost here, where, like, it's take a bunch of temporary hit points for everybody, every round, for reasons. Reading this was like the first time I ate buttered chicken. I was taken aback by how much flavor they packed into this. And yeah, maybe it is too fattening, but it was a great experience anyways. If you're going to make the Trickery Cleric interesting for players, this is a great start. Now let's play around with this and see if it is overpowered, and if so, by how much, and then make adjustments as necessary. So that is my wrap up for Playtest 6. Of course, I'll continue to talk about the Player's Handbook playtest, but my focusing in on this particular playtest packet is finally complete. What did you like the most? What did you like the least? Did you, overall, think it was a step in the right or the wrong direction? Share your thoughts below. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.